Counterspells are a very powerful effect and a staple of Blue's kit. There are very few non-blue counterspells, and the few that do exist are usually very high profile, as getting such a powerful unique effect can be very important for a ton of matchups. So today we're going to go over some of the best non-blue counterspells in Magic. And at number 10, we have Avoid Fate. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 green. It has the effect where you can target counter instant spell or aura spell that targets a permanent you control. Whereas most counterspells are used to deal with threats, this card is supposed to protect your own threats. While Avoid Fate can be very useful, it's a bit too narrow on what it can actually stop. Lots of removal spells will be sorceries, so Avoid Fate will often be unable to protect you from cards that you want to. It also doesn't actually help in counter wars, a situation where players are fighting over whether or not a spell resolves, as it can only counter spells that target permanent. Since the spell you're casting won't be on the battlefield yet, and therefore won't be a permanent yet, a counterspell targeting one of your creatures won't meet Avoid Fate's criteria. Still, it was one of the few cards that could do what it could do for quite a while in Magic. It was one of the only ways to protect your cards from removal outside of regeneration, and there were quite a few cards that got around this entirely. The Shroud and Hexproof keywords didn't exist for a long time, and there weren't too many cards trying to ape these effects, especially instants that granted this kind of effect. So this was one of the few protection spells around. Of course, now that we do have cards like Blossoming Defense and Vines of Vastwood, Avoid Fate has little purpose, as these cards mostly do everything that Avoid Fate does, but have some extra upsides. Avoid Fate hasn't had a long history of competitive play, and only really makes it onto this list by default. And at number 9, we have Withering Boon. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It has the additional cost where you have to pay 3 life. It has the effect where you can counter target creature spell. This is a pretty unimpressive rate for this kind of effect. Blue cards like Remove Soul and Essence Scatter have the same effect for the same amount of mana, but without the downside of costing you life. Now, this card hasn't really seen that much play, as it's a bit too narrow. Not to mention that black has access to all kinds of removal. The discussion about whether counterspells or removal is better is quite complicated, but when they're this narrow, removal is often better. Countering a spell can stop your opponent from getting any value off of their card. For example, countering a creature spell will stop them from getting any enter or the battlefield triggers, which can be extremely important against certain cards. However, counterspells are time sensitive, and if you don't have the mana to cast them right as the spell goes to the stack, you won't be able to do anything about them. Removal spells, on the other hand, can be drawn turns later and still be effective. This makes removal spells a lot more versatile in their application. However, counterspells usually have the upside of being able to deal with multiple kinds of threats. They can answer most kinds of spells, so no matter what threatening card your opponent plays, a counterspell can answer it. This isn't true of Withering Boon, as it only deals with one very specific card type. This means that you can leave mana up for it, and then your opponent can spend their turn doing something other than casting a creature spell, leaving you completely unable to respond to their plays. As a result of this weakness, Boon and similar counterspells have only really seen play in formats like Standard that have a lower power level and fewer options. Boon has never been reprinted since all the way back in Mirage, so it hasn't really done too much, as all the formats it was legal in had better options. And at number 8, we have Lapse of Certainty. This is an instant with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It has the effect where you can counter target spell, but then you put it on top of your opponent's library instead of put it into their graveyard. This is very similar to a blue card called Memory Lapse, though Memory Lapse only costs 2 mana instead of 3. Putting a card on top of someone's library instead of in the graveyard isn't as bad as it may seem, though it's still not good by any means. It may seem like it just returns the card to their hand, but since they have to draw it as a card return, you aren't losing card advantage. Sometimes your opponent can really be counting on a top deck to save them, so putting a card back on top of their deck can really set them back. Other times, however, they'll be more than happy to just cast the card again on their next turn. For example, if your opponent is relying on a board wipe to save them and keep them in the game, using Lapse on it will only slow them down. This means that Lapse is more of a tempo play than a real removal spell. By stalling your opponent for a turn, you buy yourself more time to execute your game plan. Considering how Lapse is supposed to be a tempo card, the fact that it costs 3 mana is kind of a big downside. 3 mana is a medium amount of mana in most standard formats, but in older formats it's a ton. Outside of the rare 4 mana spell, you're usually spending 3 mana to slow down a spell that's about as expensive or even less, making you pay more mana than your opponent does. This is a really bad deal, and a big reason why Lapse sees very little play. If Lapse saw a reprint in Standard, it might see some play in certain decks, but 3 mana for a tempo play is usually too much. And at number 7, we have Not of This World. This is an Eldrazi tribal instant with a mana cost of 7. It has the effect where you can counter target spell or ability that targets a permanent you control. And it also has the ability where it costs 7 less to cast if it targets a spell or ability that targets a creature you control with power 7 or greater. This is very similar to Avoid Fate. However, it has the massive upside of being able to cost 0 mana. 0 mana interaction is extremely powerful, as your opponent won't know that you're able to interact with them until it's already too late. Now, having to actually pay the 7 mana for this effect is pretty terrible, so it's really only ever used in decks that have giant creatures that they want to protect. Decks like Tron and Modern will often slam huge cards into play like Ulamog, and having a 0 mana card to protect it from your opponent's removal is great. Any deck that relies on 7 power creatures to win the game will at least consider playing Not of This World, though there are usually better options. In fact, lots of these giant 7 power creatures have ways to get value as soon as you cast them, so lots of players feel it's better to simply run extra copies of the threats rather than play a counterspell to protect them. After all, if you go through all the trouble to get all that mana, you really don't want to be left with only your counterspells in hand and no actual threats to play. The card has continued to see play for some years, though it hasn't really put up any major finishes recently, so it seems the prevailing wisdom is that Tron and other similar decks are better off without the card. Still, it's more than possible that the card comes back in some capacity if the right card is printed. And at number 6, we have Kozilek, the Great Distortion. This is a 12/12 legendary creature with a mana cost of 8 and 2 colorless mana. This is specifically colorless mana and not generic mana, so you need a card like Shivan Reef to add the right kind of mana to cast Kozilek, as a normal basic land won't be able to help at all. Anyway, Kozilek has the ability where whenever you cast it, if you have less than 7 cards in your hand, you draw cards equal to the difference. It has Menace, meaning it can't be blocked except by 2 or more creatures, and finally it has the ability where you can discard a card with a mana value of X to counter target spell with mana value of X. This is one of the 3 Eldrazi Titans, all of which are massive Eldritch abominations with an equally huge mana cost. Of the 3, this is the worst. The main issue is that the value of drawing a new hand of cards isn't as good as what the other Titans can give you. Ulamog, the Infinite Grier, and the Ceaseless Hunger have the ability where they can remove permanents when you cast them, including your opponent's lands. This can make it very difficult for your opponent to keep up, as they'll often barely have enough mana to continue playing. Emrakul, the Eon's Torn, gives you an extra turn, and the Promised End lets you take control of your opponent during their next turn. This lets you get a ton of value right away, as you'll either get to attack right away, triggering Annihilator and forcing your opponent to sacrifice 6 permanents, or by taking over their turn, you can use all of their cards against them. Even the original version of Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, is better, as it also has the incredible Annihilator ability. This is all just to explain why, despite the fact that Great Distortion is an incredibly powerful card, it sees so little play. It fulfills basically the exact same role as all these cards, and being the worst options means it doesn't really have a home. Some versions of the previously mentioned Tron decks do run the card, but Ulamog is by far the more popular option. Kozilek likely would be the big colorless threat of choice, but it's just outclassed by its brethren. At number 5, we have Mana Tithe. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 white. It has the effect where you can counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. This is a white version of Force Spike, a counterspell that has also seen a fair share of play. The main purpose of a card like Mana Tithe is to punish your opponent for tapping out to play a card, forcing them to play a turn behind. It's very easy to play around a card like Mana Tithe, as all you have to do is not spend all of your mana. However, doing so is often a very bad idea, as spending all your mana on each of your turns allows you to make the most powerful plays possible. So even if you know your opponent is on a card like Force Spike or Tithe, you have to spend all your mana on some turns. This makes a very interesting game where you have to consider whether or not your opponent has a Tithe up, and if it's worth playing around. However, the card hasn't really been ubiquitous, as the use cases for it are just a little too narrow. It's a little too easy to play around, and even though it's a unique effect for white to have, white decks would rather play other cards. Having to leave the mana up at the right time can make the card extremely hard to use effectively. In fact, there's a card called Daze that costs 1 and 1 blue that has the same effect, but you can cast it for free by bouncing an island you control to your hand. This card is a staple in Legacy and is absolutely format defining, and the only difference between it and Mana Tithe is that Daze doesn't require you to have the mana up on the exact turn your opponent casts a spell for you to counter. Tithe is a potentially powerful card that just hasn't really found too many metas where it can be taken advantage of. And at number 4, we have Guttural Response. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 hybrid red-green mana. It has the effect where you counter a target blue instant spell. This card plainly exists to be a way to fight back against blue's counterspells. This is a pretty common role for a card to try and fill. Lots of decks are very weak to counterspells and will often run cards specifically to shore up this weakness. For example, one of the reasons a lot of decks will run cards like Spell Pierce is due to how such a cheap counterspell can help protect your plays. However, both Pierce and Response have some major additional upsides besides protecting your plays. Response can counter any blue instant spell, allowing to do things like counter draw spells or other forms of interaction. This extra versatility has served Response well, as it's been able to outcompete other cards that try to fill a similar role. For example, Autumn's Veil is a card that makes your spells uncounterable for a turn for the same mana value. Autumn's Veil hasn't been anywhere near as successful as Response, mostly because all it can really do is protect your plays, and the extra upsides of Response generally outweigh it. Now, Response hasn't seen play recently, largely due to being usurped in its role by Veil of Summer. This is a reworked version of Autumn's Veil that's much stronger, as it allows you to draw a card if your opponent casts a blue or black spell this turn. In the final calculation, this extra card is more valuable than Response's ability to counter other blue instants besides Counterspells. So Veil has replaced Response in most of the decks it used to see play in. And at number 3, we have Tibalt's Trickery. This is an instant with an effect where you can counter target spell, then its controller mills 1, 2, or 3 cards at random. Then they exile cards to the top of their deck until they exile a non-land card with a different name. They can cast the spell for free, then they put the rest of the cards they revealed on the bottom of their deck in any random order. This card is a take on cards like Chaos, Warp, and Transmogrify, cards that dip into Red's chaotic nature by transforming one thing into something else. Like a lot of these cards, the best way to use Trickery wasn't as a risky counterspell, but rather as a combo piece. The exact plans changed depending on format, but the idea was to use Trickery on one of your own spells, and then cast a huge threat like one of the Eldrazi Titans, or even on a card like Omniscience to be able to cast all your big threats for free. This card has a bit of an interesting history. We've talked about this card before, but it was actually banned in several formats due to enabling these combos. However, these combos weren't actually all that great. The issue was more that the deck was unfun and uncompetitive, rather than being overpowered. You see, to make the deck work, you needed to basically not play anything in your deck other than lands, Trickery, and cards to counter with Trickery, and then your payoffs. So the deck was mostly full of lands and few combo pieces and would just mulligan until it found the combo. Pretty much everyone hated playing against this, so Wizards decided to just ban the card in a few formats, namely Hearthstone. And in number 2, we have Warping Wail. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 and 1 colorless. It has the effect where you can choose one. You exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less, or you counter target sorcery spell, or you create a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token with sacrifice this creature, add 1 colorless. This is a card that really shows the power modality. None of this card's 3 modes are really anything to write home about. There are better removal spells, ways to make creatures, and counter spells. However, this card has at times fulfilled a very particular role in metagames. You see, there are quite a few decks such as Urzatron, which are based around making a ton of colorless mana to play things like Eldrazi Titans. However, since most of the lands they rely on produce colorless mana, they don't have access to a lot of efficient removal, and especially don't have access to counter magic. Warping Wail, being both a removal spell and a counter spell that they could cast for colorless mana, has seen play as a meta call at different points throughout its history. Decks like Tron will sometimes decide they need a way to stop sorcery-based removal, and Wail ended up being the best way for them to cover as many bases as possible. Not only could it stop targeted removal, it could also stop non-targeted removal like Wraths and even cards like Council's Judgment, a card that non-target exiles any non-land permanent. The ability to remove certain threats has also come up. Metas where 1 power 1 toughness creatures have been a headache have been more common than you might think. And Wail's ability to answer these creatures in colorless decks has allowed it to see play. Now, these decks do also have access to cards like Dismember, a much more powerful removal spell, but Wail's modality once again sets it apart, as you can cover multiple roles in your deck or sideboard plan all at once. Wail has come in and out of favor as metas have changed, and it's not in the best spot right now. However, it's still an option that a lot of players will look to in the future to answer certain problems. And at number 1, we have Pyroblast. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 red. It has the effect where you choose one. You either destroy target permanent if it's blue, or you counter target spell if it's blue. And of course, Pyroblast's nearly identical cousin, Red Elemental Blast, is sharing this spot with it on this list. This card is extremely powerful on raid alone, as being able to answer any permanent or spell of a color for just 1 mana is something that any deck would be interested in, and it's currently extremely powerful and important in Legacy. Currently, Legacy is being terrorized by Delver decks that rely on cards like Force of Will, Daze, and Brainstorm to control the game and find their most important pieces before ending the game with a threat like Murktide Regent. You may have noticed that all of these cards share one very important trait: they're blue cards. Pyroblast is currently the most heavily played card in Legacy, with a staggering 54% usage in decks. Now, while this is to some degree a sign of blue's power level in the metagame overall, it does also show how strong Pyroblast is and how useful it is for countering these decks. Really, there's not another card that even comes close to the level powered utility that Pyroblast provides, and it's kind of a no-brainer for the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Pyroblast we moved on to our internal ban list after this, as it's taken the top spot on 2 of our lists already. Anyways, are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.